A heavy fog clung to the narrow streets of Saint-Emilion, muting the glow of street lamps and curling around the ancient stone buildings like ghostly fingers. Inspector Jules Laurent stepped from his car, the chill in the air biting through, his overcoat as he surveyed the dimly lit alley leading to the old wine cellar. A nervous officer stood by the entrance, shifting uneasily. "It's all very strange, sir," the officer said, voice low. "Nothing makes sense." Laurent nodded, stepping inside. The cellar smelled of aged oak and damp earth, the scent of decades-old Bordeaux clinging to the air. Flickering lanterns cast long shadows across the stacked barrels, their curves warped by the shifting light. In the center of the room lay a man, slumped over an overturned crate. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the dust-covered floor. Laurent crouched, studying the body. The victim, Louis Marchand, was a respected vintner who had inherited the cellar from his grandfather. A knife protruded from his chest, its hilt ornate, almost ceremonial. Laurent's fingers brushed the edge of the blade. It had been driven in cleanly, precisely, without hesitation. No signs of struggle. The officer cleared his throat. The door was locked from the inside. No other entrances, no windows. The key was in his pocket, a locked room murder. Laurent exhaled slowly, scanning the dim space. A crime too clean was often more troubling than one riddled with chaos. The wine barrels stood undisturbed, the tools of the trade neatly arranged. On wooden racks, nothing suggested a forced entry or a hurried escape. And then there was the oddest detail of all, the single cork placed delicately on the victim's forehead. "A message?" Laurent murmured. He turned the cork over between his fingers. The winery's seal was stamped into its surface, the letters slightly faded. It belonged to a bottle from a rare vintage, 1892, a year infamous for an incident that had nearly ruined the Marchand family's name. Laurent straightened. "Where is the bottle?" The officer hesitated before gesturing towards a shelf at the back of the cellar. A single empty space stood out among the rows of dust-laden bottles, its absence stark. Someone had taken it? Who found the body? One of his workers, a man named Pierre Lemoine. He said Marchand had been in good spirits yesterday. No signs of distress. Laurent motioned for Pierre to be brought in. A stocky man with calloused hands and wary eyes stepped forward, wringing his cap between his fingers. "You were the first to find him?" Laurent asked. Pierre swallowed hard. "Oui, Inspector. He was supposed to meet with a buyer this morning." "When he didn't show, I came looking." Laurent studied him. "Did Monsieur Marchand have any enemies?" Pierre hesitated. "Not that I know of, but he had been receiving letters. Strange ones. I don't know what they said, but I saw him burn a few." Laurent's gaze flickered back to the body. Letters. An empty space on a shelf. A locked door. And a cork left like a signature. Each piece of the puzzle felt deliberate, but the picture remained obscured. Who had access to this cellar? Pierre hesitated before answering. "Only a few of us, myself, Monsieur Marchand, and his business partner, Philippe Vasseur." Laurent's expression sharpened. "Where is Vasseur?" Pierre hesitated. "He hasn't been seen since yesterday. A missing man, a stolen bottle, a body locked in a room with a message left behind." Laurent exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. This was no ordinary crime. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, and someone was waiting for him to decipher it. Laurent's gaze lingered on the empty space where the missing bottle should have been. A carefully curated crime always contained an oversight, something small but significant. He just had to find it. He turned back to Pierre, who shifted uneasily under the inspector's scrutiny. "You said Vasseur was last seen yesterday?" Pierre nodded. He and Monsieur Marchand argued that evening. I didn't hear much, but it sounded serious." Laurent's eyes narrowed. A quarrel before a murder rarely felt like coincidence. He gestured for the officer to take note. Then, stepping closer to the body, he examined the victim's hands. Clean. No defensive wounds, no sign of struggle. It suggested either familiarity with the killer or complete surprise. His gaze flicked to the knife, its polished hilt, out of place in the rustic surroundings. A wine merchant was more likely to be found with a corkscrew in hand than an ornate blade. He made a mental note to trace its origin. The officer returned, holding a crumpled envelope. "We found this in the fireplace. The edges are burnt, but there's some writing left." Laurent took the paper carefully, smoothing it out under the dim light. The ink had blurred, but a few words were still legible. "Debt settled. The bottle remains." The rest was scorched beyond recognition. Laurent turned the paper over, rubbing the charred edge between his fingers. If Marchand burned this, he was trying to erase something. A threat? A deal gone wrong? Yeah. Hesitated. Monsieur Marchand never spoke of debts. Laurent studied him. Pierre's hands were steady, but his eyes darted toward the body, unsettled but not grief-stricken. A man who had worked for Marchand for years should have looked more shaken. "Tell me, Pierre," Laurent said carefully, "did you ever see the 1892 bottle before?" Pierre hesitated, and in that moment Laurent saw it, a flicker of something in his expression. Too much thought before the answer. "No, Inspector, I never noticed it missing until today." A lie. Laurent nodded as if satisfied, but he had caught the slip. Why lie about a missing bottle? What was Pierre hiding? Footsteps echoed from the cellar entrance. A man in a dark coat entered, his expression tense, a sharp nose, neatly combed hair, and the air of someone accustomed to control. Philippe Vasseur. "Inspector," Vasseur greeted stiffly, his eyes moving past Laurent to land on the body. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "This is terrible." Laurent watched him closely. Vasseur's reaction felt rehearsed, measured. Not shock. Resignation. "You were the last to see him alive," Laurent said. "Tell me about your argument." Vasseur stiffened. "It was nothing. Serious." Laurent let the silence stretch. Vasseur shifted under the weight of it. "We had business disagreements. Louis and I have worked together for years, but he was making reckless decisions lately." Laurent raised an eyebrow. "Reckless how?" Vasseur hesitated, then exhaled. "He wanted to sell something valuable. I told him it was a mistake." Laurent glanced at the empty shelf. "The 1892 bottle?" Vasseur's face hardened. "You already know then?" Laurent nodded. "And someone wanted it badly enough to kill for it." Vasseur's gaze flickered downward. His hands were clasped tightly, the knuckles white. "Louis didn't want to sell, not at first, but he was in financial trouble. He said he had no choice." Laurent absorbed the information. A rare vintage, a debt, a murder, staged too neatly. The puzzle was coming together, but something was still missing. Then he saw it. A single drop of red. It clung to the base of a barrel, barely noticeable, against the dusty wood, but Laurent knew the color of wine well, and this was not wine. Blood. And it was nowhere near the body. Laurent crouched beside the barrel, running his finger over the droplet of blood. It was fresh, untouched by dust. The crime scene had been arranged, but this detail had escaped the killer's notice. A struggle had occurred elsewhere. That meant the body had been moved. He straightened, turning to face Vasseur, who was still lingering near the doorway, his arms crossed too tightly against his chest. "Monsieur Vasseur," Laurent said, his voice calm but firm. "Where were you last night after your argument with Marchand?" Vasseur's jaw tensed. "At home. I left the cellar around 8 and went straight back to my estate. My servants can confirm." Laurent studied him. A perfect alibi, if true. "Did Marchand seem afraid when you left?" Vasseur hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "No, he was angry but not afraid. He told me he would find another way to fix his debts." Laurent filed the response away. Marchand had been desperate, yet he had not immediately sold the bottle. That suggested he had a plan, one that someone had not liked. Pierre shifted beside the detective, his discomfort growing. "Inspector," he interrupted, "perhaps we should speak with Madame Marchand. She may know more about his financial situation." Laurent turned toward the entrance. "Yes, let's." The walk through the estate was short, but as they neared the main house, Laurent took note of Pierre's hands. They were fidgeting, fingers pressing against each other, a stark contrast to his earlier composure. Inside, Madame Marchand was seated by the fireplace, wrapped in a dark shawl. Her face was pale, her eyes dry. She had not wept. Laurent inclined his head slightly. "Madame Marchand, my condolences. I understand this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you a few questions." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "I will tell you whatever I can, Inspector." "Your husband was in financial trouble," Laurent said. "Did he mention how he planned to resolve it?" Her lips pressed together for a moment before she answered. "He had spoken of a buyer, someone interested in one of his rare bottles, but he wouldn't say who." Laurent caught the slight strain in her voice. "Did he seem worried about this transaction?" She hesitated. "Not at first, but 2 nights ago he became agitated. He locked the office door when he wrote letters, which he never did before. And last night, after he argued with Philippe, he told me he needed to meet someone before making a final decision." Laurent's pulse quickened. "Did he say where?" Fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. "No, only that he would return before midnight." Laurent glanced at Pierre, who was standing stiffly near the door. If Marchand had met his killer elsewhere, Pierre would have been the one to see him return. "Pierre," Laurent said, "when did you last see your employer alive?" Pierre flinched. "Just before I retired for the night. Around 10. He seemed troubled, but I didn't ask questions." Laurent took a step closer. "And you heard nothing? No voices, no unusual sounds?" Pierre's eyes flickered toward Madame Marchand before he shook his head. "No, Inspector, nothing at all alike." Laurent knew it now. But before he could press further, Madame Marchand spoke again, her voice softer. There was something else. Laurent turned his attention back to her. "Yes." She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small, torn scrap of paper. "I found this in his desk this morning." Laurent took it gently, his eyes scanning the hurried scrawl. Midnight. The old press house. No delays. The old press house. The real crime scene. Laurent folded the note carefully, slipping it into his pocket. He looked back at Pierre, whose face had gone pale. "Pierre," he said, "I think it's time we stop pretending you don't know more than you're saying." Pierre's breath hitched, his hands clenching at his sides. Laurent watched him closely, noting the pulse flickering at his throat, the way his gaze darted toward Madame Marchand before settling somewhere over Laurent's shoulder. A man calculating, deciding what to say. "I don't know what you mean, Inspector," Pierre murmured, though his voice lacked the confidence he had maintained earlier. Laurent let the silence stretch between them, the weight of it pressing down on the room. He knew better than to force the first admission. Guilt had a way of revealing itself under pressure. Pierre's fingers twitched. Madame Marchand's breathing had become shallow, her lips pressed tightly together. They were both holding something back, but was it the same truth? Laurent shifted his stance. "The old press house," he said. "That's where your employer was supposed to
be at midnight. Did you know that?" Pierre's head jerked up, his lips parting slightly before he caught himself.
"No." Too quick, too sharp. Laurent nodded, filing the reaction away. "Then let's take a step back. Marchand owed money, that much we know. Vasseur wanted his payment, but Marchand refused to part with the rare bottle. He had another plan, one that required a secret meeting in the dead of night. And now he's dead." Laurent's voice remained steady, but his words cut like a blade. Someone knew what he was planning, and that someone met him before he could go through with it. Pierre swallowed hard. "It wasn't me." "Then who?" Laurent asked. Pierre's mouth opened and closed. His eyes flickered again toward Madame Marchand, whose fingers had curled tightly around the fabric of her dress. A quiet tension hung in the air, fragile and electric. Laurent turned his gaze to her. "Madame, you said your husband didn't tell you where he was going."
"But did you suspect?" She exhaled slowly. I thought he might be meeting someone dangerous. He was desperate, Inspector. He would have done anything to keep our home. Even—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Even what?"
Laurent pressed. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Even sell information," Laurent's mind sharpened. "Information? About what?" Madame Marchand hesitated, then spoke so softly he almost missed it. "The smuggling routes." The words settled heavily between them. Laurent took a slow breath, his thoughts racing. The wine trade in the region was a facade for deeper dealings. Luxury contraband moved through these cellars, a secret well kept by those who profited from it. If Marchand had threatened to expose someone's operation in exchange for money, he had made himself a target. Laurent turned back to Pierre. "You knew, didn't you?" Pierre's face was ghostly pale. A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Inspector Renaud stepped inside, his coat damp from the mist outside. "Laurent, we found something." His tone was urgent. Laurent glanced at Madame Marchand and Pierre before turning to Renaud. "Where?" "The old press house." Renaud's jaw was tight. "Blood, a lot of it, and something else." He hesitated, then held up a small, delicate object wrapped in cloth. Laurent took it, carefully unfolding the material. A hairpin. Laurent glanced up at Madame Marchand. Her hand instinctively reached for her hair, where an identical pin held up the loose strands at her temple. Silence. Laurent exhaled. The web of deception was beginning to unravel. Laurent turned the hairpin between his fingers, its delicate frame glinting under the dim light. A fine smear of blood stained the tip. He looked up at Madame Marchand, whose hand had instinctively risen to touch her hair, only to stop midway. Her face was a careful mask, but Laurent had already caught the flicker of realization in her eyes. Before he could speak, Inspector Renaud cleared his throat. "We also found a trail leading away from the press house toward the river, drag marks." His tone was grim. Looks like someone tried to dispose of the body before giving up. Laurent took a slow breath. The pieces were falling into place, but too neatly, too quickly. Madame Marchand's hairpin, the press house as the crime scene, the half-abandoned attempt to move the body. It was as if someone had laid breadcrumbs for them to follow. Renaud shook his head. It's her, the wife. She knew about his debts. She knew he was desperate, and she's the only one with access to his private dealings. Madame Marchand straightened, her chin lifting slightly. I had nothing to do with my husband's death. Pierre flinched at her sharp tone, his gaze darting between her and Laurent. There was something in his expression, an uncertainty, as if he knew more than he had admitted. Renaud crossed his arms. The hairpin says otherwise. Laurent remained silent, his mind working. The authorities would be satisfied with this. A scorned wife, a crime of desperation, an open and shut case. But something gnawed at him. The scene at the press house, the way the body had been staged, the missing rare bottle. Too many loose ends. Still, the commissioner wanted swift results. Within hours, Madame Marchand was taken into custody, the official statement proclaiming her the primary suspect. The newspapers wasted no time. The widow who had snapped, the woman who had grown tired of her husband's secrets. The case, in the public's eyes, was as good as solved. But Laurent sat at his desk, staring at his notes, uneasy. The hairpin. It had been placed deliberately, almost too perfectly positioned as evidence. And the blood, had it been wiped there, or had it been an accident? He needed to see it again. Retrieving the item from the evidence room, he studied it under the light. A thought struck him. If it had been pulled from her hair during a struggle, there would be strands caught in the clasp. He examined it closely. Nothing. Clean. A setup. His stomach tightened. Someone had wanted Madame Marchand to take the fall. And the real killer? Still out there, watching, waiting. Laurent rose swiftly. He had made a mistake letting the authorities close this case so soon. He needed to act before the real criminal struck again. Laurent sat in his office, staring at the hairpin under the
lamplight. The golden filigree was intricate, delicate, a piece of jewelry meant for vanity, not murder. Yet it had been found so conveniently at the scene. Too convenient. His fingers drummed on the desk. The case had unravelled too cleanly, too swiftly, as if someone had guided them toward a resolution that didn't quite fit. Madame Marchand had motive, but so did others. The missing bottle of rare wine, the staged struggle at the press house, the awkwardness in Pierre's gaze when the widow was arrested, none of it sat right. Laurent's eyes flickered toward his bookshelf, where old case files lined the shelves in worn leather bindings. His mind raced back to something, a case from years ago, one that had troubled him even after it was declared solved. Standing abruptly, he crossed the room and ran his fingers along the spines until he found it, the Montreuil affair. He pulled the file down, dust rising in the dim glow of his desk lamp. The Montreuil affair had been a scandal that shook the quiet town outside Paris. A missing businessman, later found dead near the Seine. His throat had been slit, his pockets emptied, but no signs of struggle. The only real clue had been a single wine bottle left at the scene. That bottle had come from a private collection, its label partially torn, the name unreadable. Laurent flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening. The details matched too closely to be coincidence. A rare wine bottle missing in the Marchand case, a similar clue in Montreuil.
He ran a hand over his face. Was this the same killer resurfacing years later? He needed to speak to someone who had been close to both cases. Pierre. The young assistant had acted strangely when Madame Marchand was arrested, his hesitation, his reluctance to meet Laurent's gaze. And now, Laurent realized, Pierre had been working for Marchand for years. He would have had access to his employer's finances, the wine inventory, and the press house. Laurent grabbed his coat and made his way through the fog-draped streets toward Pierre's modest apartment. The city was quiet at this hour, save for the distant hum of conversation from a café nearby. When Laurent knocked, there was a long pause before the door creaked open. Pierre stood there, eyes wary. "Detective," he said, voice taut. Laurent stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "You knew the truth about Marchand's debts, didn't you?" Pierre's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean." Laurent studied him. "The Montreuil affair," he said slowly. "You were a boy then, but your father, he worked for that businessman, didn't he?" Pierre's breath hitched. "What are you getting at?" Laurent's voice softened. "That wine bottle wasn't—"
Random? It was a message. Pierre's shoulders slumped, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't understand," he whispered. "This wasn't just about money. It was never just about money."
Laurent leaned in. "Then tell me, before the real killer decides to strike again." Laurent let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed on Pierre. The young man was unraveling, his usual guarded demeanor giving way to something raw, something tangled between guilt and fear. But Laurent knew pressing too hard would only make Pierre retreat further. He needed to be careful, precise, like a surgeon making the first incision. He stepped away, seemingly losing interest, and wandered toward the window. The street outside was still cloaked in mist, the lamps casting elongated shadows. "I spoke with Madame Marchand before her arrest," he said, his voice light, almost idle. "She swore she had never touched that wine bottle, and yet there it was, placed perfectly to implicate her." Pierre remained silent, but Laurent caught the way his fingers curled, his breath catching ever so slightly. "Curious thing about rare wines," Laurent continued, turning back. "Each batch, each bottle, carries its own distinct properties. The
aging process, the subtle notes in the aroma. A collector like Marchand would have known that." He paused, "just like someone else in his house would."
Pierre shifted uneasily, but his lips remained pressed together. Laurent reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small vial. Inside was a residue, nearly invisible against the glass. "Do you know what this is?" Pierre's brow furrowed, but he didn't speak. Laurent let a slow smile form. "It's the remnants of a very particular type of mold found in old cellars. It grows under very specific conditions: humidity, lack of ventilation, proximity to certain wood types. And yet this particular strain doesn't exist in Marchand's cellar." He let that hang for a moment, "but it does exist in another place." Pierre swallowed, his jaw tightening. Laurent leaned forward slightly. "The Montreuil estate had a hidden storage room, forgotten over the years. Except by someone who once had access to it." Pierre's fingers twitched, and for the first time his mask cracked. That's impossible," he murmured. Laurent tilted his head. "You knew about it, didn't you?" His voice was quieter now, coaxing. "Your father worked there, before it all fell apart, and you grew up around that world." Pierre's breath was uneven, his mind working furiously. The reaction was subtle, but Laurent had him. He let the silence stretch again, watching the tension coil in Pierre's shoulders. Then, with deliberate slowness, he set the vial on the table between them. "Tell me, Pierre, why was the past brought back into this crime?" Pierre's mouth opened, then closed. A war was raging behind his eyes, and Laurent knew he had just set the final trap. Laurent knew the moment Pierre left the room that the boy was close to breaking. His fingers had twitched, his breath had faltered, small cracks in an otherwise impenetrable shell. But Laurent had seen it before. Guilt, fear, the weight of a secret pressing down on someone who wasn't yet sure if they should confess or run. He exhaled slowly, letting his mind work through the next steps. The mold sample had been a gamble, but Pierre's reaction confirmed what Laurent already suspected. This case was tied to something far older than the crime itself, the Montreuil estate, a buried past. Laurent turned back toward the evidence table, scanning the neatly arranged items. The wine bottle that had condemned Madame Marchand, the broken cufflink found near the study, the ledger with its torn pages, and the vial still sitting where he had left it. His fingers brushed over its cool surface, and then he froze. The weight was wrong. Lifting the vial, he tilted it, watching the way the residue inside shifted. It was subtle, but there was less
than before.
Someone had tampered with it. A sharp tension settled in his chest. He had just used this to shake Pierre, meaning it had been intact moments ago. That meant someone in this very building, had slipped in and altered it under his nose. He turned sharply, scanning the room. The door was still shut, the window locked. The officers had been preoccupied, questioning staff members down the hall. But someone had moved quickly. Laurent's fingers tightened around the vial. He strode out into the corridor, his sharp gaze scanning the faces of the officers, the servants, the lingering figures who had gathered in quiet clusters. Someone was trying to erase the truth before he could uncover it. His eyes landed on Inspector Moreau, who was speaking in hushed tones with one of his men. Moreau was competent but cautious, always preferring a neat, orderly case to the messier realities of true crime. Laurent had seen it before. When facts became inconvenient, Moreau had a habit of favoring what fit the narrative rather than what the evidence suggested. Laurent stepped closer.
"Inspector?" Moreau turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Laurent, have you made progress?" Laurent held up the vial. This was tampered with. A flicker of something crossed Moreau's face. Surprise, irritation, something else?
It was gone in an instant. "Tampered with? Surely you don't think—" "I know what I'm saying." Laurent's voice was steady. "Someone altered the contents within the last few minutes, which means whoever did it is still here." The weight of the statement settled over the group. Officers shifted, glancing at one another. The tension thickened. Moreau sighed, rubbing his temples. "Laurent, we have a suspect in custody. Madame Marchand had motive, and the evidence aligns. We need to be careful about chasing ghosts when—" Laurent stepped forward, lowering his voice so only Moreau could hear. "If the evidence aligns so perfectly, why is someone trying to destroy it?" Moreau hesitated. That was all Laurent needed. He turned on his heel and strode past the officers, heading toward the forensics lab. If the vial had been altered, it meant the rest of the evidence was at risk too. The moment he pushed open the door, he knew he was too late. The table was in disarray. Papers had been shoved aside. The ledger, the wine bottle, the cufflink, gone. The very pieces that could dismantle the official narrative had vanished. Laurent's jaw tightened. Someone wasn't just working against him. They were ahead of him. The sharp scent of disinfectant clung to the air, but it did nothing to mask the chaos before Laurent. The forensics lab, once an orderly space of cold logic and hard evidence, was now a battlefield. Drawers had been yanked, open, folders tossed carelessly to the floor. But it was the absence, the void where the most damning pieces of evidence had been, that sent a slow, burning anger through him. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for. Laurent moved quickly, scanning the room for anything left behind. A mistake, a trace. His fingers ghosted over the edge of the steel table, where a fine layer of dust had been disturbed. He crouched, eyes narrowing. A faint, almost imperceptible smear of something dark trailed along the floor. Blood. No, something thicker, inkier. Oil. Before he could investigate further, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Laurent!" He turned to find Inspector Moreau standing in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide. For a man who prided himself on control, the barely masked urgency in his voice set Laurent on edge. "There's been another attack," Moreau said, his breath short. "Pierre Vauclair is missing." Laurent straightened. Missing was in the holding room. The officers stepped away for just a few minutes. When they returned, the door was open and he was gone. Laurent's mind worked fast. Pierre was already under immense pressure, unraveling with every question. If someone had taken him, it was to silence him. If he had run, no. Laurent didn't believe Pierre was capable of orchestrating an escape.
On his own. Not under these circumstances. He strode past Moreau, his mind shifting gears. Where was he last seen? Moreau fell into step beside him. Security cameras caught him in the hallway just before he vanished. We have men checking every exit, but it's as if he disappeared into thin air. Laurent's jaw tightened. Not vanished. Taken.
As they moved through the station, a low murmur of voices carried from the briefing room. Officers stood in tense clusters, speculation running rampant. Laurent ignored them, pushing through until they reached the security room. Inside, a technician was replaying footage on a flickering screen. "There," the officer pointed. The grainy image showed Pierre pacing inside the holding room. He ran a hand through his hair, restless. Then abruptly, he turned toward the door. For a moment, he simply stood there, then he stepped forward. The door opened. Laurent leaned in. "Pause it." The screen froze. Pierre wasn't forcing his way out. He wasn't panicked. He was responding to something. Rewind 10 seconds. The footage rolled back. Laurent watched closely as Pierre lifted his head, almost as if he heard something.
A voice? A signal? And then he moved toward the door. Was anyone else in the hallway at this time? Laurent asked. The officer hesitated. No one visible.
But the cameras don't cover the entire corridor. Laurent exhaled slowly. Someone had drawn Pierre out. Someone who knew exactly where the camera's blind spots were. Check external footage. Any movement near the exits? The officer tapped at the keyboard. A few seconds later, another screen flickered to life. A side alley behind the station. Empty. Then movement. A figure, barely distinguishable in the shadows, stepping back into a waiting car. Laurent's eyes narrowed. License plate. Covered. A
calculated move. Every step of this had been planned. Moreau's voice was low. They took him, but why? Laurent already knew the answer. Pierre was a liability.
Someone had orchestrated this from the beginning. Tampered with the evidence, manipulated the investigation, and now removed the one person who could expose them, and they weren't finished yet. A chill settled in Laurent's bones. This wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. It was about stopping the next one before it was too late. Laurent stood in the dimly lit security room, the glow from the monitors casting sharp angles across his face. Pierre's disappearance had shifted everything. The case had felt like a tangled web, threads crossing and twisting in unpredictable ways. But now something was beginning to align. He could feel it. He replayed the footage again. The way Pierre turned toward the door, the hesitation in his movements. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. He had known whoever was waiting for him on the other side. Moreau exhaled sharply beside him. "We need to find him before it's too late." "We will," Laurent said, his voice firm. But his focus remained on the screen. Something about the moment just before Pierre left still nagged at him. He slowed the footage frame by frame. There. A shift in Pierre's expression. His lips moved just slightly. Not forming a full word, but Laurent's pulse quickened. He had mouthed something. He turned to the technician. "Enhance the image." The officer hesitated. "It's low resolution. We can sharpen it. But do it." The pixels adjusted. The clarity improved, if only marginally. Laurent studied the shape of Pierre's lips. A name, not a plea. Not an exclamation. A name spoken just before he stepped into the unknown. Laurent whispered it under his breath. "Mireille." Moreau stiffened. "The journalist?" Laurent nodded, already moving toward the door. Mireille Dubois had been a thorn in his side since the investigation began, always a step too close, always asking the right questions. She had sources he couldn't, trace information she shouldn't have. He had dismissed her as an ambitious reporter, hungry for the next big headline. But what if she had been more than that? What if she had been inside this from the beginning? The drive to her apartment was short, the rain streaking against the windshield as Laurent's mind raced. He had been looking at this case from the wrong angle. Every move had seemed disconnected. Pierre's paranoia, the missing evidence, the calculated timing of the attacks, but now a thread was pulling everything together. As they pulled up to the building, Laurent took in the darkened windows. No lights, no movement. Moreau frowned. "She wouldn't be here if she's involved." "She might not have had a choice," Laurent said. They took the stairs 2 at a time. Laurent knocked sharply. No response. "Dubois, open the door." Silence. Moreau exchanged a look with him before reaching for the knob. Locked, Laurent took a step back and slammed his shoulder against the wood. The door gave way, swinging inward to reveal an apartment in disarray. Papers were strewn across the floor, the scent of overturned coffee lingering in the air. A laptop sat open on the table, screen cracked. But it was the chair in the center of the room that stopped Laurent cold. The rope dangled loosely, as if hastily cut. Whoever had been restrained here was gone. "Mireille," Moreau muttered. Laurent's jaw clenched. Someone had taken her. Maybe to silence her, maybe for leverage. His gaze swept the room. The mess wasn't random. Whoever had been here had been looking for something. But what? Then his eyes landed on the desk. Among the scattered notes and open folders, something stood out, a photograph. He picked it up, his pulse hammering. It was an old image, slightly faded at the edges. A group of people. familiar faces. Pierre was there, but so was Mireille. And standing behind them, smiling in a way that sent a chill down Laurent's spine, was the one person they had never considered.
A suspect! The pattern had been in front of them all along. Laurent tightened his grip on the photograph, his mind racing.
The faded image told a story he had failed to see before, a connection hidden beneath layers of deception. Pierre, Mireille, and the man standing just behind them, the one who had orchestrated everything from the shadows. Moreau leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "That's—" "Yes," Laurent said, his voice grim. "And it means we've been looking in the wrong direction this entire time." The man in the photograph was François Delacroix, a name that carried weight in the Parisian elite, wealthy, respected, untouchable, a patron of the arts, a benefactor of charities. And yet here he was, woven into the past of two people who had become central to the case. Moreau exhaled sharply. "If Delacroix is involved, this isn't just a murder case. It's something much bigger," Laurent nodded, already piecing together the implications. Delacroix had funded countless ventures, many of them seemingly philanthropic. But behind that carefully crafted facade, rumors had always swirled, whispers of influence peddling, of debts that could never be repaid. And now, it seemed, of something even darker. He turned back to the mess of papers on Mireille's desk, scanning them with renewed urgency. If she had been taken, it was because she had uncovered something dangerous, something Delacroix couldn't afford to let her expose. Then he saw it. A folder tucked beneath a stack of scattered notes. The label was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. Le Cercle. Laurent's pulse quickened. The name had surfaced before, buried in old reports. An exclusive group made up of the city's elite. Membership was secret, its true purpose unknown. Some dismissed it as just another social club. Others whispered that it was something far more sinister. He flipped open the folder. Inside were pages of notes, documents, and his breath caught. List of names, prominent figures, politicians, business magnates, judges, and at the top, François Delacroix. "This isn't just about Pierre's murder," Moreau murmured, scanning the list. "This is about control, influence," Laurent clenched his jaw, "and silencing those who dig too deep." He understood now. Pierre hadn't been killed over some petty feud or financial dispute. He had known something about Lyti, Circle, and Mireille had been close to exposing it. Delacroix had always been several steps ahead, orchestrating the game from a position of power. But he had made one mistake. He had underestimated Laurent's determination. Moreau's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. They found something. Laurent followed him out without a word. The drive to the river was silent, the air thick with tension. When they arrived, officers were already on site, their flashlights casting eerie reflections on the water's surface. A body had washed ashore. Laurent braced himself as he stepped forward, the weight of what he was about to see pressing down.
On him, Mireille. Her hands were bound, her face half submerged in the mud. The rope burns around her wrists told him she had fought, a slow, burning rage built in his chest. Delacroix had silenced her, just as he had silenced Pierre. Moreau placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get him!" Laurent's gaze hardened. No more games. Delacroix had made a mistake, and Laurent would make sure he paid for it. Laurent stood outside the grand estate of François Delacroix, his fingers tightening around the worn edges of the case file.
the ski.
Weight of the investigation pressed against his ribs like a physical force. Inside that house was the man who had orchestrated everything. The murders, the disappearances, the silence.
Laurent had spent his career chasing criminals who thought themselves untouchable, but Delacroix was different. He didn't just break the law, he shaped it to his will. Moreau leaned against the car, watching Laurent closely. "You sure about
This?" Laurent exhaled slowly. "I don't have a choice." The invitation had come earlier that evening, an unexpected gesture from Delacroix himself.
a dinner, a conversation, a chance to clear the air? It was an obvious play, an attempt to gauge how much Laurent knew. But what Delacroix didn't realize was that Laurent wasn't coming for answers. He was coming for an ending. The guards at the entrance barely glanced at him before letting him through. They knew who he was, knew he had no real power here. But they didn't know how far he was willing to go. Inside, the estate was a testament to excess. Chandeliers cast, golden light over marble floors, and the air carried the faint scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey, the kind of luxury that insulated men like Delacroix from consequence. The man himself was waiting in the study, seated in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of cognac swirling between his fingers. He smiled as Laurent entered, as if they were
"Old friends meeting after years apart." "Detective," Delacroix said smoothly, gesturing toward the chair opposite him.
"You look like a man who has seen too much." Laurent didn't sit. "And you look like a man who's done too much." Delacroix chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Straight to the point. I admire that." He set the glass down, his eyes sharp despite his relaxed posture. "I assume you're here about Mireille?" Laurent's jaw tightened. He knew Delacroix would try to control the conversation, to steer it in a direction that suited him. But Laurent had no interest in playing along. "I know about Le Cercle," he said. "I know about the names, the influence, the people you've silenced to protect it." Delacroix exhaled, feigning disappointment. "Detective, you've been chasing ghosts. Do you truly believe such a thing exists?" Laurent reached into his coat and tossed the folder onto the table between them. Pages spilled out, names, financial records, correspondence that linked Delacroix to every shadowy decision that had led to this moment. Delacroix glanced at the papers, but didn't flinch. He simply shook his head. "And what do you plan to
"Do with this?" "Take you down," Delacroix sighed, as if Laurent had disappointed him. "You're an intelligent man, Laurent, but intelligence without pragmatism is wasted."
He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. "What do you think happens next? You think you walk out of here and the world suddenly turns against me? These names on paper, what are they without proof that the world will acknowledge?" Laurent felt his pulse quicken. This was what power did. It eroded truth. It made justice feel like a game with predetermined winners. But Delacroix had made one mistake. He believed Laurent had come here alone. A faint chime echoed from the corner of the room. Delacroix's expression barely shifted, but Laurent saw it the smallest flicker of realization. Laurent pulled his phone from his pocket, turned the screen toward Delacroix. The recording app was open, the light blinking steadily. The room fell into silence. For the first time, Delacroix hesitated. Laurent stepped forward, his voice calm. That was live. Delacroix's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think that changes anything?" Everyone who needs to hear it just did. Moreau had been waiting outside, broadcasting the entire conversation to the authorities. By now, the weight of Delacroix's words was already crashing down on him. The admissions, the arrogance, the belief that he could talk his way out of anything. For a long moment, Delacroix didn't move. Then he reached for his glass, taking another slow sip as if nothing had changed. But Laurent could see the shift, the way his fingers tensed slightly against the glass, the realization that for the first time he was no longer in control. A knock at the door, then another. Delacroix set the glass down with quiet finality. "You've sealed your fate, detective." Laurent met his gaze evenly. "No, Delacroix, I just ended yours." The doors swung open and the room flooded with officers. As the officers moved in, Delacroix remained composed, his fingers still resting lightly on the rim of his glass. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, but Laurent had seen enough men like him to know what came next. Some fought, some begged, and some, like Delacroix, simply watched the pieces fall into place with quiet calculation, already searching for a way to twist the outcome in their favor. "François Delacroix," one of the officers announced, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder." Delacroix exhaled slowly and lifted his hands. "Of course," he murmured, almost amused. "But you should be careful, detective. A man who thinks he's won often stops looking over his shoulder." Laurent ignored him, stepping back as the officers secured Delacroix's wrists in steel. But something gnawed at him, something in the way Delacroix's lips curved into a faint smirk, as if he knew a secret Laurent didn't. Outside, Moreau leaned against the car, arms crossed, as he watched Delacroix being led to the waiting vehicle. "That's it, then," he said. "It's over." Laurent didn't answer immediately. He should have felt relief, satisfaction. But something was wrong. Moreau narrowed his eyes. "Laurent?" Laurent's mind was spinning, replaying the night's events, the confession, the arrest. It had all gone too smoothly. Delacroix had been too willing to talk, too willing to be caught. The man had spent his entire life evading justice, manipulating the world to suit his needs. A person like that didn't simply fall into a trap without a fight. He turned back toward the estate, his pulse quickening. "Something's not right." Moreau frowned. "What are you talking about? We got him." Laurent wasn't listening. He was already moving, retracing his steps into the house. The study was exactly as they had left it. The half-empty glass of cognac, the folder of damning evidence scattered across the desk. But then Laurent saw it. A single sheet of paper tucked beneath the file, barely visible. A note with a steady hand. He pulled it free and unfolded it. "You've caught the wrong man."